It's a long way from the sudden traumas of the coronavirus to Boston's long period of disinvestment in the late 20th century. But you could think of it in terms of a spreading infection, or at least as a mystery that needs to be solved. In other words, the makings of a thriller. That's what our guest has done with a work of fiction that's set in Boston in the mid-1970s. It's called Redlined. We'd like to welcome the author, Richard Wise. Thank you very much for being with us, Richard.
Pleasure, Chris.
Richard, you didn't just write a book that was set in Boston in the 1970s. You lived here at the time. You were a community organizer in Jamaica Plain. What was that like for you?
Well, I was hired by a coalition of churches, or contracted with by a coalition of churches, to come and organize to stabilize the central neighborhood of Jamaica Plain, which at that time was in, I would say, a state of rapid decline. There was something like 32 abandoned buildings in the central neighborhood alone. Police protection was limited. The streets needed work. The whole infrastructure seemed to be crumbling. And the churches wanted to do something about it.
Well, at the time, pretty much all throughout the country, people were moving out of urban centers and buying houses in the suburbs. Boston was no different. But there were other things going on in Boston that were even more disruptive all along that southwest corridor. Some of us know that story pretty well, but refresh the memories of some other people, or tell some people who don't know anything about this. What was going on there?
Well, the southwest corridor was a real problem. I-95 runs in a straight line from Florida, Maine to Florida. There's one place that it doesn't run, and that's right through the center of Boston. And it doesn't do that because the neighborhoods, Roxbury, Jamaica Plain, Highland Park, stopped the highway, but they didn't stop it quickly enough. By the time they did stop it, the whole area had been demoed. So you had an 8-lane demoed no man's land running from Route 128 through almost to the Prudential Center.
Well, of course, in the minds of people in the neighborhood, what they also saw were declining property values, and at the same time, they saw arson. And what were they thinking in their minds at the time?
Well, I think everyone was thinking that Jamaica Plain was essentially going down the tubes. It was going in the direction of the South End, which at that point was almost totally demolished and being rebuilt. And a lot of people wanted to leave the neighborhood, not only for the normal reasons that people wanted to move out to the suburbs, because the suburbs were seen as part of the American dream. But the problem they had was they couldn't sell their homes. And those people who wanted to fix up some of the properties, and there were some exceptional properties, particularly in Sumner Hill and Parkside, they couldn't get home improvement loans to make those improvements.
Well, of course, the strange thing was this contradiction here, because on one hand, it seems perfectly reasonable for banks to not want to lend money in an area like this, but there were other people who saw opportunities to make money, and that's what your book is about. So tell us about how those things come together.
Well, yeah, I think you can make a lot of money destroying a neighborhood. And that's, I think, what was going on in Jamaica Plain at that time. Regular people couldn't get mortgage money or home improvement money, but speculators could. So it was a situation where, due to the mortgage problem, 95% of all housing is transferred via a mortgage. So without a mortgage, the housing market essentially crashes, which means that if you've got cash, you can buy cheap. And then you can take that property that you bought cheap and you can convert it to multifamily and rent it out, often to tenants on welfare under the Section 8 program, and you've got a cash cow.
Now, of course, you also had this background as a community organizer, and I guess you at least trained in the methods of Saul Alinsky. I found it fascinating reading about the methods in your book. Tell us a little bit about how those addressed what was going on in the neighborhood.
Well, Alinsky's method is fairly simple. He's been denounced by the right as a communist and so forth, but basically he was an Athenian Democrat. He believed that ordinary people could solve their problems. The reason that they were unable to was a lack of power. So his objective was to empower regular people, working, middle class, poor people, to make change. And that was what I did. That was the philosophy that I worked with. And when I went into those neighborhoods and I asked the questions, often I heard, oh, there's an abandoned house and nobody's boarded it up and we're afraid it's going to burn down. And we would organize, say, a block, and we would get that abandoned building taken care of. But it didn't take a genius to realize that, okay, now we've boarded up an abandoned building, or we've torn down an abandoned building. Well, now what have we got? An abandoned lot. So what happens next? The lot fills up with trash. So we were like the little Dutch boy, sticking our fingers in the dike every time it sprung a leak, but we weren't solving the underlying problem. And the underlying problem was there was no money to finance the market.
When I read the book here, there are these blow-by-blow descriptions of these meetings and something. You hear these ragtag neighborhood leaders and radical organizers, but in the bigger picture, this led to something really significant, like the Community Reinvestment Act nationwide, didn't it?
Yes, we were part of the coalition. Once we built the organization, the Jamaica Plain Banking and Mortgage Committee and the Boston Anti-Redlining Coalition, we joined with about 30 cities nationwide to pass a couple of pieces of national legislation, one of which required national disclosure of lending patterns. And the other was called the Reinvestment Act, which tried to target cities to bring funds in to help rehab these cities, because it's awful lot less expensive to rehab than it is to totally rebuild.
And of course, one of the other things that was eventually unearthed was that the racial disparities in lending weren't just about people's ability to pay back the loan. There were other things going on, and I guess this all stems from what was going on in the grassroots activities.
Well, yeah, I mean, back in 1934, FHA did two things, one of which was very good and one of which was very bad. What it originally did was it created a situation where you could get a mortgage, and you could get a mortgage for over an extended period of time. Prior to the early 1930s, mortgages were granted for 5 to 7 years, and typically the payback was only the interest. So at the end of 5 years, you had no equity. FHA changed all that. The other thing it did was it created a series of maps of every urban area in the United States, and it determined that those areas which were mainly white would be green, and those neighborhoods which were at least partly black were red. So essentially the federal government created redlining back in the 30s.
Well, your book has all this research about the redlining, the shady real estate deals, Alinsky's methods, but you also have some very interesting characters. One of the most attractive, I think, was a woman, make sure I get the name right here. Is it Mary Cavanaugh in the book? And I think I knew her in real life. Edwina Winky Clarity. Why is she so special?
Well, Edwina, or Winky Clarity, was an exceptional neighborhood leader. She worked not only to stop I-95 going through the neighborhood. She was the chairman of the Jamaica Plain community group that stopped the redlining in Jamaica Plain, and then she was part of the group that built the park in the Southwest Corridor. 3 steps, it seems to me, the most important things that happened that brought Jamaica Plain back from the brink. Jamaica Plain is a vibrant, diverse community today, amazing place. When I did my book launch in Boston, it took place in Jamaica Plain, and I was astonished. I really hadn't visited the neighborhood but once in 40 years, but I was astonished. The neighborhood is vibrant. And had those 3 things not happened, I think we would have had a situation just like the South End. The neighborhood would have essentially become a slum, then would have had to be totally rehabilitated.
One of the things I think I miss from the 70s, and there's an example of this, maybe more than one in your book, is how community meetings could be a real theater of accountability. You had an example of that in your book. Tell me about how that worked out.
Well, I'm not sure which one you're talking about. Was it the meeting?
You had the state banking commissioner being badgered by people from the neighborhood.
Well, it was interesting when we invited the banking commissioner to meet with us, and the people, Winky Clarity and a fellow by the name of Bill Pasquina, outlined the problem. Her response was amazing. Her response was, well, you know, we care about how the banks lend their money, but we don't care at all where they lend the money, which showed an amazing lack of understanding of the problem and the problems faced by urban areas in Boston and well, throughout the Commonwealth, throughout the United States. And here, she was the commissioner of banks. And in the book, I set up and I show how the meeting was conducted. But most everything that she says, the fictional commissioner says, are direct quotes from what the actual banking commissioner said at the first meeting between herself and the community.
When you wrote the book, there were some things, especially in the later chapters, that seem a bit far-fetched. They're not what I remember from the 70s, but on the other hand, here we are, we have a president who's a casino developer, so I guess you must have been thinking, well, you know, maybe that's not so far-fetched.
Well, what was the Southwest Corridor? As Alex Jordan, one of the protagonists in Redline, says, it's 52 acres with a 6-lane access to the center of Boston. The corridor had great potential. But in Redlined, in order to create a mystery thriller, I had to come up with a couple of different plots. The one plot, the redlining plot, is almost verbatim truth, how it actually happened. The other plot, which involved the casino, never happened. It was totally fictional. But it did allow me to produce the sort of murder and mayhem that's necessary for a good thriller.
I want to ask you about some of the atmosphere in this book, because you mentioned some cases, some places rather, that I remember fondly that no longer exist. The Vorst House, and especially Doyle's. What about the events that have led to those places to disappear?
Well, you know, I mean, a lot of that is sort of far beyond the scope of the book in some ways, but when the interesting thing is, and maybe this relates somewhat to what I did after I was a community organizer. I was involved in luxury retailing, and everybody thinks that when you put a luxury retailer in a place, that you know everything turns around. That the luxury retailer is going to make a fabulous ton of money, but the truth of the matter is that a T-shirt shop is going to make more money. So you have the luxury retailer, and the price of his rental keeps going up, and eventually it reaches the point, and also neighborhood restaurants also fall into that category. They reach the point where they can't afford the rent, and so what happens is the community becomes cheap souvenir shops and T-shirt shops.
You know, one of the things that puzzles me. What brought you to Boston to begin with?
Well, I was offered a contract by the Ecumenical Social Action Committee in Jamaica Plain, ESAC for short, to come in and organize in the central neighborhoods. Prior to that, I'd organized a statewide tenant group in Rhode Island for a couple of years, and I was recommended by another community organizer by the name of Stanley Holt, who was active in Providence at that time.
We should mention that if people want to get a copy of this or download it, is there some way that they can seek that?
Oh, well, yeah, Redline's available in hardcover, softcover, It's an ebook, and within a month it'll be an audiobook. And you can buy it on Amazon, you can buy it on Barnes & Noble, or through your local independent bookstore.